Okay, so we've talked about weakness before, but let's look at it in a bit more detail. So this video will be about categorizing the weaknesses, um, looking at causes, and then the diagnostic characteristics of each weakness. We're not going to look so much at the relevance of the different types of weakness. That'll come in the next module and the following ones. There are, of course, a number of ways of categorising weakness, but we're going to look at it my way, simply because it fits into the overall course structure better. But it's a perfectly valid way of doing it. So we've got neurological weakness. These are the ones I think probably you're most familiar with, and the ones you automatically think of as soon as you see somebody who is weak. But that's not true. This may not even be the most common form of weakness or the common cause of weakness. It's probably neurophysiological weaknesses that are going to be much more common than this. But let's look at neurological. So we have them coming from the nerve root, spinal nerve radiculopathy. We can have peripheral nerve problems with neuropathies. We can have compromises with exoplasmic flow. Now this is fast flow because you lose replenishment of the of neurotransmitter substances at the synapse. Now, this can be classified as neurophysiological, but I think it's better with the neurological one because this is a mechanical compression or distortion of the nerve that causes this. And it's under this particular area where you start thinking of multi-crush syndromes. And then we have central neurological problems, spinal cord, brainstem, and the brain proper. Neurophysiological types. Pain inhibition is a big one. This is an automatic reflex giving way of the muscle due to the amount of pain being generated by its contraction. It can occur with type 2 muscle tears, fractures, and really severe joint arthritis. Not all tissues do this for some reason, but most will. If the pain gets to a certain level, the muscle cuts out. We then have segmental facilitation, which we'll talk of a lot more in the following modules, but you've got a taste of it already. So this is basically a lowered threshold response, lower threshold in the spinal cord that produces a bigger response than you're expecting. Now, this is almost certainly nociceptively caused. It's the only one that makes any sense to me anyway. So you get segmental facilitation. There is then incoordination, neurophysiological incoordination, and that produces weakness. And then it's reflex inhibition, which is local, whereas segmental facilitation is seen throughout the segment. This is local to the joint that's causing the reflex inhibition. And we'll look at all of the characteristics of each of these. And then we have structural weaknesses, macrotraumatic tears, degenerative tears, but a deficiency in the substance of the muscle. So even when the pain's gone, you can expect the muscle to be somewhat weaker than it should be, depending on how large the tear is. Okay, causes of weakness. Right at the top of this, not because it's preeminent, but simply because I put it somewhere and it's got no errors coming from it, is deconditioning weakness. This is what happens when you've been in a cast for a very long time, and the muscles can get atrophied and they can get weak. The weakness and atrophy is sort of all around the area that's been in the cast, and generally speaking, the strength will come back reasonably quickly with appropriate exercises, although the atrophy may not. But this isn't something that won't respond to exercises. Over on the other side, we've got structural weakness. So the cause of this can be slow flow, AXT compromise. This is where it becomes trophically malnourished because the stuff isn't going through the nerve reaching the end organ. So the muscle can become malnourished, and then you start seeing degenerative tears, even, and microtrauma will cause this, and sometimes no trauma at all, just doing what you do normally, which can't really be considered traumatic. So you get a degenerative tear in there, and that produces weakness, not because of the pain necessarily, simply because the structure has been compromised. You can rupture the tendon of the muscle, as I say. You've lost muscle bulk, you're going to lose muscle strength. And that tear is replaced by scar, which doesn't improve the force output of the muscle. So this can lead to permanent weakness if the tear is big enough for you to notice. And then you can atrophy from different neurological diseases, which can also change the structure of the muscle and make it weak. Not just a neurological condition, but the atrophy of the muscle. Also, it's worth remembering that reflex inhibition can produce atrophy. Now, this isn't just the muscle getting hypotonic and flaccid. This is replacement of muscle by fat. When that happens, you lose strength as well. Okay, on the neurological side, peripheral neuropathies can play a major role in producing weakness, simply because the muscle is actually innervated by a single nerve, and so it doesn't matter how many segments are innervating the muscle. The fact that they all end up going through one nerve means if the nerve's compromised completely, the muscle's completely compromised as well. So you can get complete atrophy, you can get complete paralysis from peripheral neuropathy. Just depends on how bad the neuropathy is. With a radiculopathy, you don't see the same extent in forms of weakness. You're almost never going to see paralysis with a radiculopathy. You're much more likely, much more likely to see paresis because of the multi-segmental nature of the innervation to that muscle. Then neurological diseases are obviously going to cause either central or peripheral problems. Okay, now down at the bottom we've got neurophysiological. I think this is probably, you're going to see much more weakness caused by neurophysiological problems than you will by the other two combined. So first off, we've got pain inhibition. Straightforward. You do so with the patient, you resist in a test, pain comes on, muscle gives way. Simple as that. Segmental facilitation will produce weakness because you've got incoordination now between what you want to do and what your muscle wants to do. So it's weak from that perspective. And reflex inhibition, where you've got hypotonicity in the muscle and it's reflexively weakened as well. And then, of course, fast flow AXT, where you lose neurotransmitter substances to the synapse and you're going to get very rapidly fatiguing weakness. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if the fatigability that you see with radiculopathy isn't purely this axoplasmic flow compromise causing it. Okay, let's have a look at the identifying characteristics of these types of weakness. Now, I've confined this to simply neurophysiological versus neurological. As far as mechanical stresses are concerned, generally speaking, there is a history of pain with a tear, even a degenerative tear. There will be pain, and there certainly will be tenderness in the muscle itself. The weakness is basically not fatigable, but there is a definite weakness from side to side. And the pain with degenerative tears anyway can be really quite difficult to elicit. It can either be brought on by stretching or by contraction. Strong isometric contraction. This isn't a mild contraction, it's a strong, usually a strong isometric contraction. It often takes a full base and body weight. For example, if this is a tear in the calf muscle, the chances are you won't be able to reproduce this manually. The patient's going to have to go up and down their toes. For the acute tear, that's not true at all. I mean, basically, stretching and a mild contraction will create all sorts of pain and it'll be extremely tender. So these are not the big issue. The big issue is differentiate between the different types of neurophysiological weakness and the different types of neurological, and between neurophysiological and neurological weakness. So this is what we're concentrating on now. So if we look at the neurological side first, radiculopathy is almost certainly the one you come across much more commonly than the others. So we're going to see a quasi-segmental distribution of the signs and symptoms here. Quasi-segmental because the muscles are multiply innervated, as is the skin. So it will be a quasi-segmental distribution. The weakness will be fatigably weak. That is, it'll get weaker and weaker and weaker with repeated contraction really quite quickly. There will be paresis, not paralysis, and there will be hypoesthesia and not anesthesia. The reflexes may be hyporeflexive, or there may be some mild that you simply can't see what the difference is between that one and the other side. And there's no mediator. That is, doesn't matter what we do. Short term, going in there, wobbling the joint, contracting the muscle, it doesn't really matter what we do. it makes no difference to this weakness. So the moderator, there is no moderator for this type of weakness. Disease conditions, neurological diseases, pretty much all have the same thing in common. The signs and symptoms by far outweigh the amount of pain that's being generated. But after that, the signs and symptoms are variable in distribution, in severity, and so on. It depends on how severe the disease is and what structures are being affected by it. But basically, if you've got massive signs and symptoms and much relatively less pain, then you're probably looking at a neurological condition. Myelopathy, you're obviously not going to see a complete myelopathy walk into your clinic, but you can get different degrees of it. MS can sort of get in there as well. So the distribution is going to be spinal cord. So basically, if it's in the if it's in the thoracic spine, it's going to be in the legs. If it's in the cervical spine, it's going to be in the arms and the legs, maybe. So you're going to see upper motor neuron signs below the level of lesion, lower motor neuron signs at the level of lesion, and normal above the level, at least for a while, because above the level can become cavitated by an increase in the syrinx because CSF will not be able to get down. But that's over time, so but at that point it's well diagnosed. You're looking for minor lesions, they're not big things. You'll see hypertonicity, spasticity, and hyperreflexia, and all the other signs. Probably, if you're looking at the neck, Hoffman's looks to be about the most sensitive sign for this. And lower down, you're obviously looking at Clonus and Babinski, and so on. Peripheral neuropathies, distribution depends on which part of the nerve's affected. This is everything. Basically, a radiculopathy is a peripheral neuropathy. They react much the same way, except for the completeness of the lesion that can occur with peripheral neuropathy. But that's actually a lower motor neuron lesion if it's the nerve root. But forgetting that, the distribution of this will be depend on what's affected. Now, if the large peripheral nerve has been affected, it'll be in a peripheral distribution. But if it's in a digital part, further out on the nerve, you're going to see a unique distribution based on what nerves being affected. Also, this is where multiple crush comes into it. So you'll get a crush, say, in the neck, another crush at the elbow, and maybe a crush at the wrist, for example. Where you'll see the signs of this will be distal to the most distal crush. Usually. Now, it can be the second crush is causing everything from there down. But if this is summating on its way down, the distal crush, it will be distal to the distal crush. So you're going to see the same things you see with a radiculopathy, but worse, generally speaking. Hypotonicity, hyporeflexia, hypoesthesia, moving into anesthesia, and paresis moving into paralysis. And the atrophy here is much worse than it is with a radiculopathy. On the other side, the neurophysiological one, we've got axoplasmic flow compromise. Now, the distribution of this is variable, again, much like a peripheral neuropathy. In fact, it's very much like the peripheral neuropathy. So, depending on where these compromises are occurring, you'll see the signs and symptoms distal to where that the final block is on it. And you'll see, you're probably not going to see much in the way of sensory loss or reflex changes. And what you're going to see is fatigable weakness. Now, unlike the neurological side where moderators don't make any difference at all, here they can do. Simply by repositioning, it's possible to change that weakness. By moving the nerve around, you can actually improve the flow rate through the nerve. Also by pumping, some of these quadrant techniques where you're doing neural tension techniques, you can pump in that as well, and that can change this temporarily anyway. So you can moderate this, although I said there are no moderators. This can be moderatable. Don't forget also you'll see an arrow go between radiculopathy and AXT. This is just showing that AXT can be considered either as a neurophysiological problem or as a neurological problem. My lean is towards the neurological side, but there wasn't any room on that side for it, so it went on the neurophysiological. Reflex inhibition, it's local. It's local to the cause of the weakness, and it's patterned. It tends to form PNF type patterns around. It's interesting. I'm not sure why this is, but you'll see that it's a patterned local weakness. There's hypotonicity and breaking weakness. It'll hold for a bit and then it will suddenly give way. Not a long time, but you'll feel it suddenly give way. This is best tested with knee-centric contraction. You can pick it up much more easy that way. So there's no reflex changes. There's no sensory changes, and it can be moderated by local input of mechanoreceptor. So if you move the joint repeatedly for a little while, the tone will come up, and so will the strength. Facilitated segment, basically caused by nociceptor as far as I'm concerned anyway. The distribution is segmental, regardless of where the cause is. So we can get segmental distribution, segmental facilitation caused by a wrist problem, which facilitates the C5-6 segment, and you'll see that evidence of that wrist problem, the facilitation from the wrist problem throughout the C5-6 segment. It is non-fatigable weakness. I think I've got there fatigable. It's non-fatigable weakness, and the reflexes become brisk, and there is hypertonicity in the reflexes, deep tendon reflexes. You can get a dysesthesia with this as well, and you can get hyperesthesia. So things that should be painful can be painful. So you see this around the shoulder quite a lot. You do an isometric test, and you'll see a painful response to it. But there isn't a tendinopathy there, and the tendon will be tender as well. That isometric contraction and the tenderness can go away as soon as you get rid of the segmental facilitation. Scratch test, looking for reactive hyperemia, will be negative. You'll either see a white spot. Now you're doing this along the segment. You'll see a white spot in the over the paravertebral muscles where you scratched it, or the red streak will thin in and then come out again. So it's really can be quite a quick reflex. You've really got to watch this, because then it will feel. Moderate for this is mechanoreceptor input anywhere within that segment. It doesn't have to be in the spinal you don't have to be moving the spinal segment. You can do it anywhere in the spine throughout that segment. Although at the level of the spine, this input works better. You have a more profound effect with it, but it can be done anywhere. And that's the difference between the two. If I've got a reflex inhibition and I wobble the neck, it's not going to make any difference to that reflex inhibition. Wobbling the elbow will, but if I do wobbling the elbow, it will also change the weakness caused by segmental facilitation. So the order in which you test is quite important. If you think it might be reflex inhibition, or you're not sure if it's reflex inhibition or segmental facilitation, wobble the neck. If there's no improvement in the strength around the joint, then you've got reflex inhibition there. Okay, this was a quick overview of weakness, very quick overview. My strong suggestion is that you pause on the flow charts and read them and go on from there. Well, you'll get much more on neurophysiological weakness in the modules following this one. So, a bit of patience and all will be revealed to you. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.